An empire can appear immeasurable in power at the precise moment it has become hollow in function. That is the terrifying paradox at the heart of AD 1644. The Ming dynasty, which had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries, still possessed the rituals of supreme authority, the vast architecture of civilization, and a memory of command over a world-spanning tributary system. But memory is not capacity. Ceremony is not resilience. And when the great heavy doors at Shanghai Pass finally swung open, the fate of the Chinese subcontinent turned not on one battle alone, but on the accumulated failure of a system that could no longer convert its immense power into basic order. To understand why that gate mattered, and why its opening remains one of the most profound geopolitical hinge points in human history, the lens must first widen. The fall of the Great Ming was not the simple, binary overthrow of one ruler by another. It was the total, agonizing collapse of an entire governing equilibrium. It was the failure of taxation, the breaking of military logistics, the dissolution of provincial compliance, the fracturing of frontier defense, the starvation of the grain transport networks, the death of elite consensus, and ultimately, the evaporation of moral legitimacy. Dynasties do not endure by the sword alone. They endure because millions of human beings, from provincial magistrates and frontier soldiers to wealthy merchants and toiling peasants, continue waking up every day and behaving as though the center can still coordinate the realm. Once that collective belief weakens, the architecture of the state becomes a trap. Every strain becomes exponentially more dangerous than its material scale would suggest. A poor harvest is no longer just a localized famine, it becomes a contagion of rebellion. A budget crisis is no longer a temporary deficit, it becomes a catastrophic frontier disaster. A political purge in the capital is no longer just court intrigue, it becomes strategic blindness. The Ming state did not fall because it was suddenly weak. It fell because its immense, intricate complexity became a lethal liability when the environment turned hostile and the governing class lost the capacity to adapt. By the early 17th century, Ming China remained, by almost any metric, among the most sophisticated and formidable states on earth. Its bureaucracy had few rivals in sheer scale and administrative ambition. Its cultural prestige radiated across East Asia. Its cities were sprawling hubs of commerce, its agrarian base was astonishingly deep, and its political tradition was ancient, tested, and intellectually formidable. Yet, the breathtaking grandeur of the Ming concealed a hard, unforgiving truth about human governance: administrative complexity is a luxury of stable times. The empire had been meticulously designed by its founder to process abundance, enforce hierarchy, and maintain a static perfection. It was entirely incapable of processing simultaneous, compounding crises. One of the most corrosive, invisible pressures crushing the Ming state involved a metal dug from the earth thousands of miles away. It was silver. Through a profound shift in economic policy known as the single whip reform, Ming taxation had become deeply, inextricably entangled with the flow of global silver. The state had monetized its fiscal obligations, requiring peasants and merchants to pay their taxes not in grain or labor, but in silver bullion. This arrangement worked beautifully under favorable commercial conditions, driving an economic boom fueled by silver pouring in from the Spanish Americas via the Manila galleons, and from the mines of Tokugawa, Japan. But a state that anchors its survival to a monetary medium it does not perfectly control places its throat in the hands of global forces it cannot even see. When the Spanish crown restricted the Manila trade, and the Japanese shogunate tightened its exports, the flow of silver into China suddenly constricted. The effects were not abstract economic theories, they were immediate, brutal, and visceral. As silver became scarce, its value skyrocketed relative to the copper coins used by the peasantry. A farmer selling his crops for copper suddenly found that his tax burden, owed in silver, had doubled, then tripled, without the state ever officially raising the rate. Local society felt this crushing pressure first. Provincial administrators, terrified of missing their quotas, squeezed harder. The court in Beijing felt it last, but by the time the financial panic reached the Forbidden City, the damage had already spread like a necrosis through the arteries of the state. A fiscal shortage in a vast empire is never merely a shortage of money. It becomes a shortage of grain movement. It becomes unpaid troops mutinying on the northern frontier. It becomes a halt in the repair of the Grand Canal. It becomes the death of transport animals, the evaporation of political trust, and, most fatally, the exhaustion of time. Then came the environmental stress, a catastrophe delivered by the heavens themselves. The 17th century plunged the globe into the depths of the Little Ice Age. Climatic instability intensified all existing fragilities. Temperatures plummeted. The growing seasons shrank. The monsoon rains failed. In the arid northwest, particularly in Shaanxi province, harvest failures were absolute. But environmental disaster is rarely evenly distributed, and in an empire, unevenness itself is a powerful destabilizer. Some regions endured unimaginable scarcity, others saw massive floods of climate refugees, others suffered the explosion of banditry, and others faced spiraling hyperinflation. Local suffering, in a crumbling system, does not remain local. It moves. Hungry populations relocate, carrying desperation with them like a plague. Armed men, whose wages have been stolen by corrupt officers or vanished in a silver drought, do not simply starve quietly, they reorganize around plunder. Magistrates, stripped of emergency funds, resort to cruel improvisation. Communities, realizing the state will not save them, protect themselves by hoarding grain, evading taxes, building local militias, or aligning with whichever warlord appears strongest in the valley. States survive natural scarcity only when they can move relief faster than desperation spreads. The Ming imperial machine, paralyzed by lack of funds and bureaucratic inertia, increasingly could not. But hardship alone does not doom a dynasty. Human history is deeply scarred by states that survived famine, total war, and vicious succession crises. The fatal issue for the Ming was not the presence of crisis, but the nature of interaction. The Ming was not facing one isolated storm. It was facing a hyperstorm, a convergence of furies that magnified one another in a deadly resonance. Silver shortages weakened the tax base. Therefore, military financing suffered, leaving soldiers starving and angry. Military weakness and mutiny encouraged peasant rebellion in the interior and invited frontier anxiety in the north. Therefore, the court was forced to divert more energy and its dwindling treasury toward emergency military responses, starving the civilian sector. Because the state was failing, political infighting in the capital intensified, as factions sought to place the existential blame on their rivals. Therefore, honest information became politically dangerous, telling the emperor the truth was a fast track to execution. Because information degraded into sycophancy and lies, the court's strategic decisions worsened. Therefore, every subsequent crisis became exponentially harder to solve. This is the true anatomy of collapse. This is how great systems truly break, not through one fatal wound, but through the terrifying acceleration of feedback loops. While the interior burned with rebellion, on the northern frontier, beyond the Great Wall, a different kind of threat was coalescing. The rising Manchus were exerting a pressure that was military, psychological, and political all at once. The Ming dynasty had centuries of experience with steppe threats and frontier management. Fighting nomads was built into their geopolitical DNA. But the new challenge was far more sophisticated than the familiar pattern of nomadic raid and retreat. The force emerging beyond the passes, first united by Nurhasai and then refined by his brilliant successor Hong Taiji, was not a mere tribal confederation. It was becoming a state. It was learning, integrating, and institutionalizing. It absorbed captured Ming artillery experts, integrating the devastating, red barbarian, cannons into their siege warfare. It adopted the formidable 8-banner system, a brilliant method of military and social organization that dissolved old tribal loyalties and forged a disciplined, centralized war machine. Frontier defense consumed millions of taels of silver, mountains of grain, and the absolute limits of the court's command attention, resources it could no longer mobilize with any confidence. The Ming military structure, the ancient Weisuo system of hereditary soldiers, had long since decayed into a network of impoverished farmers dominated by corrupt officers. Garrisons that existed as formidable armies on the ledgers of the Ministry of War were, in reality, phantom forces, their numbers inflated by commanders pocketing the wages of dead or deserted men. Officials at the center, desperate for victories, demanded outcomes that local realities could no longer possibly sustain. To the emperor in Beijing, the map still looked imperial, dotted with fortresses and armies. But the machinery underneath was beginning to violently seize. Inside the Forbidden City, the internal politics of the Ming court made any rational adaptation nearly impossible. Eunuch influence had long been a combustible issue in imperial governance. This was not because eunuchs alone determined all outcomes, but because they became the proxy symbols in larger, vicious factional struggles over access to the emperor, moral virtue, and ultimate control of the state apparatus. Factions of scholar officials, most notably the moralistic Donglin Academy, weaponized Confucian morality against their rivals. Political purges did not merely remove enemies, they poisoned the entire ecology of decision-making. In a healthy system, disagreement can refine policy, exposing flaws and forging consensus. In a brittle, paranoid system, disagreement becomes an accusation of treason, accusation leads to paralysis, and paralysis guarantees strategic failure. An empire can survive the relentless pounding of external enemies far longer than it can survive a ruling class that treats every national crisis as a test of personal righteousness rather than a matter of institutional survival. At the very center of this swirling, apocalyptic maelstrom stood the Chongzhen Emperor. History, in its desire for neat narratives, often grants the rulers of fallen empires either the dignity of tragic, doomed competence or the simplicity of obvious, decadent failure. Chongzhen belongs to the first category, but only partly, and in a way that is deeply painful to analyze. He was neither indifferent nor idle. He did not lose his empire to wine or concubines. He was highly intelligent, relentlessly industrious, and acutely, terrifyingly conscious of the danger surrounding the dragon throne. But diligence inside a failing system can become its own special form of tragedy. Chongzhen inherited a court already deeply scarred by mistrust, reeling from the purges of the eunuch dictator Wei Zhongxian. He confronted military emergencies on multiple fronts, fiscal disarray, rebel expansion, and complete administrative exhaustion. Because he cared desperately about saving the dynasty, he wanted control. Therefore, he intervened constantly. But intervention from the center, without reliable information from the periphery, creates a unique kind of autocratic blindness. The emperor knew there was a crisis. He could feel the foundations shaking. But he could not always know which military reports were true, which logistical failures were structural, and which high officials were disguising total collapse in the soothing language of temporary difficulty. His punishments mattered deeply. In periods of severe stress, leaders often instinctively tighten discipline in the hope of restoring performance. They execute generals to motivate the rest. Sometimes, in the short term, that works. But if subordinates quickly conclude that reporting bad news is far more dangerous than hiding it, the upward flow of truth simply collapses. Then the center governs shadows. The Chongzhen Emperor, operating under immense, crushing psychological pressure, repeatedly dismissed, demoted, imprisoned, or executed commanders and officials when campaigns inevitably went wrong. His execution of the brilliant General Yuan Chonghuan by slow slicing was a trauma the military never forgot. Some of those punished perhaps deserved it. But the broader, systemic effect was highly corrosive. Honest reporting became a suicide gamble. Commanders facing impossible odds against the Manchus or the rebels still had overwhelming incentives to promise impending victories. Officials confronting local breakdown and famine still had incentives to minimize the scale of the danger. Therefore, the court received the pristine appearance of governance long after the actual substance had begun to rot away. This is one of history's oldest, most lethal political traps. When rulers fear betrayal above all else, they often create the exact conditions that make accurate loyalty mathematically impossible. Against this weakening, paranoid center rose the man who would tear down the sky, Li Zicheng. It would be a profound analytical mistake to picture his movement as mere chaos, a swarm of locusts wearing a crown for a season. Rebellions of such scale are not accidents, they are complex political organisms. They draw their raw kinetic energy from grievances, but they only become historic, world-altering forces when someone gives that grievance a clear direction. Li emerged from the absolute bottom of the Ming hierarchy. He was a former postal relay station worker, laid off in a desperate government austerity measure designed to save silver. He was born of a world of unpaid, mutinous soldiers, ruined farming communities, massive dislocated populations, and seething local anger at magistrates who still ruthlessly demanded tax obligations from people who had already eaten the bark off the trees to survive. Li Zicheng did not invent this pain. He organized it. That distinction changes the universe. Li's supreme strategic talent lay in the power of simplification. The late Ming crisis was structurally, economically, and legally complex, but successful insurgents rarely campaign on complexity. They identify the visceral, emotional logic of collapse and translate it into a program simple enough to mobilize men, secure towns, and invite elite defections. His platform was devastatingly effective: relief from oppression, severe, violent punishment of corrupt officials, and the complete replacement of a failed dynasty. The slogan "Equally divide land and abolish the grain tax" was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Such ideas gain unstoppable force when the existing state can no longer guarantee either justice or basic survival. In this environment, every unpaid Ming soldier becomes a recruitable asset for the rebellion. Every starving, plague-ridden district becomes a reservoir of rage. Every local notable who doubts the center's ability to protect his property becomes a potential collaborator, or at least a passive hedger. When a dynasty finally loses the fundamental argument that only it can preserve order, revolt stops looking like treason to the heavens, and starts looking like rational policy. Yet, as his massive armies swept toward the capital, Li Zicheng faced the classic, brutal problem of revolution. Destruction and governance are not twin skills. They are fundamentally separate arts, requiring completely different temperaments. It is one thing to break a deeply hated tax regime, to overrun an isolated garrison, or to drag a corrupt regional governor into the streets. It is another thing entirely to preserve the delicate grain supply of a massive city, to secure the bureaucratic compliance of the educated elite, to manage complex urban administration, and to persuade the scholar official class that the long-term future belongs to your new order rather than to any force promising the restoration of the old. Rebellion feeds on kinetic momentum. Government feeds on static routine. A movement built exclusively for the first must transform rapidly and seamlessly to achieve the second, or it will inevitably consume itself. To the northeast, watching this internal combustion with predatory patience, stood the third power center, the Manchus. Their staggering rise to power had been consistently underestimated by the Ming court, precisely because they were continually treated as merely another familiar frontier menace. Under the foundational genius of Nurhasai and then the empire-building vision of Hong Taiji, they built robust institutions that gave endurance to their conquests. The banner system provided unbreakable military cohesion and a scalable social organization that could absorb conquered populations. But military structure alone does not explain their ultimate success. The Manchus adapted politically. They consciously incorporated Han Chinese defectors, giving them high rank and crucial administrative roles. They adopted and reshaped the ancient, powerful language of Chinese imperial rule. They changed their dynastic name to Qin, meaning clear or pure, a deliberate cosmological challenge to the Ming, which meant bright or fire. They did not present themselves simply as destroyers coming to burn the cities. They actively cultivated the possibility of becoming legitimate rulers of the whole world. This was the strategic brilliance that many collapsing regimes fail to perceive in time. The most dangerous external enemy is not the one that simply wants to raid the state and take its wealth, but the one that meticulously learns how to replace it. Hong Taiji, before his sudden death, had already moved far beyond tribal consolidation toward grand dynastic ambition. Administrative forms expanded to mirror the Ming. Symbolic claims to the mandate of heaven sharpened. The emerging Qing project, now guided by the brilliant regent Prince Dorgan on behalf of the child Xuanji Emperor, was not a temporary coalition of horsemen looking for winter plunder. It was an alternative imperial machine in formation, waiting in the shadows. Strategic patience became one of its greatest, most lethal weapons. The Ming still possessed massive defensive walls, heavily armed cities, and a powerful aura of legitimacy recognized across much of East Asia. Therefore, a direct, frontal conquest under unfavorable conditions would have been a catastrophic risk for the heavily outnumbered Manchus. But if the Ming center cracked from within, if the emperor fell to his own people, and if domestic actors, terrified of the ensuing chaos, opened the path, then outside force could become inside sovereignty with astonishing, terrifying speed. This is exactly where Wu Sangue enters the stage of history, not merely as a Ming general, but as the living hinge upon which the fate of East Asia would turn. He commanded significant, elite, battle-hardened forces on the critical northeastern frontier and occupied the fortress of Ningyuan and the Shanhai Pass, a position of immense, unparalleled strategic consequence. Geography had given him immense leverage. He controlled the narrow corridor between the mountains and the sea. Politics made that leverage explosive. As the Ming order collapsed behind him, he suddenly stood isolated between the failing Ming center, the massive insurgent force of Li Zicheng rolling toward Beijing, and the highly organized, waiting ambition of the Manchus. In stable times, military commanders serve the state unquestioningly. In collapsing times, commanders become political arbiters, whether they desire that terrifying role or not. Such figures do not choose in freedom. They choose under crushing pressure, in the fog of war, amid completely incompatible loyalties, while knowing that every possible option carries the weight of a catastrophe. Then came the spring of AD 1644, the season in which the long crisis finally ceased to be recoverable. Li Zicheng's massive peasant armies advanced on Beijing with a momentum the Ming military apparatus could no longer arrest. The capital city, once the unquestioned, awe-inspiring center of imperial command, suddenly revealed how much of the dynasty's true power had become purely ceremonial. Defenses were not entirely absent, the walls of Beijing were massive. But the coordination was totally broken. The treasury was empty. The soldiers on the walls, ravaged by a recent plague and unpaid for months, refused to fight. Confidence had utterly decayed. The Chongzhen emperor frantically rang the bells to summon his ministers for a final council, but the halls remained empty. The officials had already fled or were hiding in their homes, waiting for the new master. The court that should have embodied the unshakable permanence of the realm now resembled a dark chamber in which each participant understood the absolute danger, but no one possessed the capacity to master it. Great capitals do not only fall because powerful enemies arrive at their gates. They fall because, long before the first siege ladder is raised, the internal systems of belief and logistics that make a capital governable have already quietly died. When Beijing fell to Li Zicheng's forces in April 1644, one world ended immediately. The Chongzhen Emperor, completely abandoned by the final, tragic insufficiency of the system he so desperately tried to save, climbed the artificial hill of Jingshan behind the Forbidden City. There, he hanged himself from a tree, leaving a final note scrawled on the silk of his robe, taking the blame for the empire's ruin but condemning his officials for betraying him. That image, the Son of Heaven dead on a lonely hill, became immortal because it condensed far more than personal despair. It marked the absolute death of a dynastic center that could no longer defend its walls, command its officers, or sustain the belief of its people in its continuity. In formal, historical terms, this profound event should have settled the succession crisis. A powerful rebel conqueror had taken the imperial capital. The reigning emperor was dead. The dynasty's heart had stopped beating. But in the brutal arena of high politics, formal victory is not always decisive. Sometimes, the exact moment of triumph is the moment a fatal, new weakness is exposed to the world. Li Zicheng had captured Beijing. But capturing Beijing was not the same as governing China. This distinction is the graveyard of rebellions. The city was a powerful symbol, a treasury, an administrative core, and an enormous political prize. But it was also a massive logistical burden. A conquering force entering the imperial capital had to prove immediately, within days, that it could do what the fallen Ming no longer could: command the vast network of provincial officials, reassure the terrified wealthy elites, stabilize the volatile urban order, secure the complex grain supplies from the south, and project an aura of total legitimacy outward into the resisting provinces. Every hour mattered. Every report mattered. Every single interaction with surrendered Ming officials mattered. Because a new regime born of violent rebellion cannot assume obedience. It must actively manufacture confidence before the forces of resistance can regroup and counterattack. Here, the old, unforgiving problem of revolutionary transition reappeared in its most severe form. Li desperately needed the active cooperation of the scholar officials, the landholding elites, the city administrators, and the military officers who had served the old dynasty. But many such men had every reason to hesitate. They watched as Li's generals, strapped for cash, began systematically torturing former Ming officials to extract hidden silver. Some feared the confiscation of their ancestral estates. Some doubted the discipline among the rough, battle-hardened rebel ranks who were now looting the capital. Some fundamentally abhorred the rural, uneducated social forces that had carried Li to power. Some simply followed the ancient, pragmatic political instinct of waiting to see whether a new ruler can actually survive his first major test before committing their loyalty. Political legitimacy is often less a sacred doctrine than a calculated wager. The elites of an empire ask not merely who has won the capital, but who can keep winning long enough to make obedience a rational strategy. Meanwhile, far to the northeast, General Wu Sangui confronted his impossible, world-breaking choice. The old sovereign he had sworn to protect had fallen. The rebel regime now held the capital and had his family in their custody. The powerful Manchus waited just beyond the frontier passes, an avalanche of cavalry ready to descend. 3 options presented themselves, and none were clean. First, submit to Li Zicheng, accept the new Das-Han dynasty, and try to preserve his military influence under the new order. Second, resist both sides, turning his army into an independent warlord state, and gamble on survival in a 3-way war of attrition. Or third, ally with the Manchus, inviting into the heartland of China a foreign force that might first appear as a helpful partner, but would almost certainly become the absolute master. Such decisions are incredibly easy for later generations to moralize after the outcome is known. They are far, far harder to understand in the living moment, when information is fragmented, emotions are raw, and the timeline for strategic survival collapses into a matter of days. Personal motives have often dominated the popular, dramatic retellings of Wu Sangui's choice. Stories of outrage over the rebel treatment of his father, vengeance, fear for family interests, and the legendary anger over a beloved concubine taken by a rebel commander all circulate around the decision. Some of these elements may contain truth. Humans are driven by passion. But history becomes dangerously shallow when it reduces civilizational turning points to mere private melodrama. The larger, overriding issue was purely strategic. Wu Sangui needed a force capable of completely defeating Li Zicheng and restoring a system of order under which his elite military position could remain meaningful. Resisting alone against both the Manchus and the million-strong rebel army was statistically improbable. Submitting to Li may have looked possible for a fleeting moment, but only if Li could rapidly secure elite legitimacy and military discipline, and reports of the torture of officials in Beijing proved he could not. That outcome was highly uncertain. The Manchus, by contrast, under the brilliant regency of Dorgan, possessed tight organization, overwhelming military force, and a highly developed, sophisticated political language of dynastic replacement. They offered order. Therefore, the unthinkable became the only practical path. General Wu Sangue made his choice. He opened the massive gates of the Shanhai Pass. That single act transformed the nature of the crisis forever. A domestic succession struggle instantly became a continental transfer of power. The pass was not merely a physical gate in stone and brick. It was a threshold between political universes. By admitting the vast Qing forces through one of the great strategic corridors into the North China Plain, Wu altered the fundamental geometry of the war. Li Zicheng, marching out of Beijing to crush Wu Sangue, was no longer confronting just the remnants of a broken dynasty. He was confronting a terrifying new synthesis, an alliance that fused local Chinese military legitimacy and artillery with a highly disciplined, fresh, external imperial contender. In that instant, as the banners aligned at the pass, the struggle ceased to be simply about who had seized the physical city of Beijing. It became a war about who could plausibly claim to restore civilization itself. The ensuing Battle of Shanhai Pass mattered because battles matter deeply when they crystallize a larger strategic reality. In a massive, brutal clash, complicated by a blinding spring dust storm, the Qing heavy cavalry, hidden behind Wu Sangue's lines, unleashed a devastating flanking charge that shattered Li Zicheng's elite veterans. But the military collision alone does not explain why this victory proved so decisive. The deeper, more enduring issue was narrative legitimacy. Dorgan and the Qing could now enter the Central Plain not solely as foreign invaders coming to conquer, but as righteous avengers of order, marching to punish the bandits who had forced the Ming emperor to suicide. That ideological framing was politically invaluable. Countless Ming officials, scholars, and local elites who might have fiercely resisted a naked, violent conquest could now rationalize their cooperation with a force that presented itself as restoring stability and Confucian order after the unthinkable outrage of rebel usurpation. The sword of the Manchus opened the road. But it was the story they told that secured the road. Li Zicheng had attempted one of history's most dangerous political transitions at the worst possible moment. He won the capital city, but he did not win the governing class. He seized the golden throne room, but he did not secure the durable obedience of the realm. He brilliantly embodied the social rage of the starving masses, but he could not quickly enough convert that kinetic rage into a respected, static imperial center. Therefore, his massive victory actually destabilized his own position. Every systemic weakness became visible at once: lack of discipline, poor administration, elite mistrust, logistical strain, and deeply uncertain legitimacy. Revolutionary acceleration had brought him from the starving villages of Shaanxi to the gates of Beijing. But momentum could not keep him there. His army broke, and he was forced to flee back into the interior, his brief dynasty evaporating into the dust. For the Qing, speed and symbolism now worked together in perfect, terrifying harmony. Entering Beijing shortly after Li's hasty retreat, the Qing leadership did not merely occupy a conquered city. They gracefully occupied the vacant center of dynastic continuity. The young Xuanzhi emperor, guided by the regency directing Qing grand strategy, inherited the immense, mind-bending challenge of ruling a civilization far larger, far older, and vastly more administratively complex than the Manchu homeland. But the Qing had meticulously prepared for this in principle long before they possessed it in fact. They immediately adopted the grand grammar of Chinese imperial rule. They buried the Chongzhen emperor with full honors, weeping at his tomb. They preserved Ming administrative structures wherever they were useful. They employed defectors and reassured surrendered officials that their ranks and properties were safe. They framed their staggering rise not as the destruction of the Chinese imperial order, but as its divine rescue and continuation under a new, more vigorous house. Conquest only becomes durable when it learns to speak the language of the conquered state better than the defeated dynasty can speak it itself. This did not mean that resistance vanished overnight. Far from it. The Great Ming did not simply disappear in a single season of changing banners and proclamations. Loyalist resistance persisted fiercely across the southern regions. Southern courts attempted to sustain Ming legitimacy under remnant imperial claimants, fighting desperate, doomed campaigns. Military struggles, sieges, and massacres continued for decades. Memories of betrayal, the imposition of the Manchu Q hairstyle, and the profound loss of Han sovereignty hardened into a bitter cultural trauma. For many scholars and patriots, AD 1644 became not merely a dynastic date, but a deep moral wound in the soul of the civilization. The question of what had actually been lost was never only political. It was deeply civilizational, emotional, and ethical. What had truly failed, a specific ruling family, an entire educated class, a philosophical moral order, or the fundamental capacity of the imperial state to protect its own people from compounding catastrophes? Yet the Qing ultimately succeeded where so many nomadic conquerors of the past had failed. They did not merely occupy and extract. They inherited, they adapted, and they vastly expanded. Over time, they would rule China for nearly 3 centuries, doubling its territory and presiding over one of the absolute largest and most successful imperial formations in the history of the world. That astonishing outcome should strongly caution us against simplistic notions of outsider victory. The Qing triumphed not because Chinese institutions were inherently flawed or irrelevant, but because those exact institutions remained powerful enough, and structured well enough, to be fiercely worth mastering. The late Ming state had built an imperial framework of tremendous, awe-inspiring depth. Its true tragedy was not that the framework itself had no value. Its tragedy was that its own ruling center had become entirely too brittle, too paranoid, and too starved of truth to command it effectively at the exact moment of existential trial. This is the larger, haunting lesson concealed beneath the blood and drama of AD 1644. Human societies, in every era, routinely mistake visible scale for actual resilience. The Ming still possessed massive walls, millions of registered officials, vast standing armies, tribute systems extending across oceans, and all the blinding symbolism of universal authority. But actual resilience lies elsewhere. It is invisible until it is tested. Resilience lies in the quiet incentives that still produce truthful reporting from the lowest ranks to the highest. It lies in fiscal systems that have the elasticity to still function under extreme strain. It lies in military commands that still trust the political center enough to fight and die for it. It lies, above all, in populations that still genuinely believe that suffering within the existing system is fundamentally preferable to gambling on the terrifying forces outside of it. Once that deep, psychological faith decays, grandeur simply becomes a heavy costume worn by a collapsing order. Li Zicheng's dramatic rise revealed another permanent, uncomfortable truth about human societies. Social desperation is never politically inert. It does not simply vanish. It waits. It accumulates in the dark corners of the empire. It searches desperately for language, for leadership, and for simplification. Once those elements are found, it can move with astonishing, world-breaking speed. Comfortable elites often fatally underestimate this because they confuse local distress with local containment. But distress networks itself. It spreads through migration, through rumor, through military desertion, through unpayable debt, through hunger, and through collective grievance. A state can completely ignore these warning signs while its financial ledgers still seem to function and its high ceremonies still impress the foreign ambassadors. But when the inevitable day of reckoning finally arrives, the sheer speed of the breakdown always shocks the very people who had confidently insisted, just days before, that the system remained fundamentally stable. Wu Songui's terrible decision revealed something even darker about the mechanics of collapse. At the very edge of political ruin, individuals placed in strategic bottlenecks can redirect the fate of millions with a single command. Such historical actors rarely operate under ideal moral conditions. They choose amid terror, wild ambition, overwhelming confusion, and deeply compressed time. Posterity often judges them simply by the binary metrics of loyalty or betrayal. But the harder, more rigorous historical analysis asks what type of decayed system produces moments where a single, isolated commander's calculation can completely reorder a civilization. It is a sign not of individual omnipotence, but of total institutional exhaustion. When the great, stabilizing structures of a society finally fail, history passes through individual persons with terrifying, destructive intensity. And the Qing demonstrated perhaps the most unsettling, profound lesson of all: outsiders triumph most decisively when insiders willingly invite them in as the necessary price of ending chaos. This historical pattern is far older than China and vastly larger than any one dynasty. It appears across the globe whenever basic order becomes more precious than political continuity. When a population, an exhausted elite class, or a fractured military command no longer asks who possesses ancestral legitimacy, but simply asks who has the power to restore safety, the great gate begins to open. Sometimes that gate is literal, like the massive doors of stone and iron at Shanghai Pass. More often, it is purely political. The invitation may be deeply reluctant, highly tactical, or born of absolute desperation. But once made, it can rewrite the centuries. The final verdict, then, is intensely severe. The fall of the Great Ming was not merely the tragic defeat of one paranoid emperor, nor the victory of one ambitious rebel, nor the triumph of one patient frontier state. It was the total unraveling of a complex governing system whose internal components had ceased reinforcing one another and had begun, instead, to accelerate each other's catastrophic failure. The Chongzhen emperor inherited a machine already breaking beneath him, and his actions only stripped its final gears. Li Zicheng masterfully exploited real and massive social misery, but he completely lacked the institutional capacity to turn kinetic rebellion into durable governance before a stronger political synthesis overtook him. Wu Sangui, standing alone at the bleeding hinge of war and legitimacy, made the cold, rational choice that opened the North China Plain to the Manchus. And the Qing, vastly more prepared for imperial succession than their enemies fully grasped, transformed a fleeting opportunity into a 300-year dynasty. The final cost was counted not only in millions of lives and decades of brutal campaigns, but in shattered loyalties, long resistance, and a memory of transition that remained morally charged for generations. The modern mirror held up by this history is impossible to ignore. States in every age, including our own, can preserve the magnificent outward architecture of authority long after the inward capacity to actually govern has thinned to nothing. Government budgets may still pass. Bureaucratic offices may still function on paper. National ceremonies may still reassure the public. But if the truth is routinely punished, if institutions structurally reward the concealment of failure, if social pain compounds faster than economic relief, and if political factions prefer moral victory over strategic adaptation, then apparent stability can become a highly dangerous illusion. The grand lesson of AD 1644 is not safely confined to dynastic China. It is a blaring warning about the fragility of all complex societies. Collapse begins long before the capital falls, and political legitimacy becomes instantly fragile the moment order and justice cease arriving together. There is also a harder, final reflection about human nature itself. In times of profound security, legitimacy appears to be deeply principled. In times of chaos, legitimacy becomes brutally practical. People speak passionately of rightful rule, inherited order, and sacred moral continuity. But when the violence spreads to their doors, when the hunger deepens in their streets, and when administration totally fails, many begin asking a much simpler, darker question: who possesses the sheer power to stop the disintegration? This does not make human principles meaningless. Rather, it reveals their ultimate dependence on basic function. A state is loved most securely when it can successfully protect, arbitrate, and endure. When it can no longer do those things, even the most ancient, sacred loyalty starts yielding to urgent, terrifying necessity. And so the grand legacy question remains, echoing out from the stones of Shanhai Pass. When a civilization faces internal disorder severe enough that peace can only be restored by the overwhelming force once feared as alien, what exactly has already quietly died before the gate is finally opened? If you want to understand how other great empires disguise their own collapse until the very last moment, click the video on your screen right now. And before you go, tell me in the comments below, in the modern world, what do you think is the absolute first sign that a political system has stopped functioning? Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the grand architecture of human history. The past is never truly dead, it is simply waiting to be understood.